Now, we are very honoured that David Benjamin was able to find an opening in his schedule to be with us this evening, and indeed to visit Britain at all. David was a career officer in the IDF's Military Africa General's Corps, where he ultimately served as Chief Legal Advisor for the Gaza Strip and as Director of the Strategic and International Branch in the International Law Department, and he remains an active reservist in the IDF. But he now practices as a lawyer and consultant, specialising in international law, law of armed conflict and counter-terrorism. He's the founder and director of SILS, Security and International Law Specialists, an international consulting service providing advice and training in matters of international law relating to national security and counter-terrorism. Without further ado, I invite David to take the floor.
Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. Contrary to what you said, I didn't really require that much persuasion to come here. Through emails and through the odd thing that I see on the internet, I've been able to get an impression of the kind of things that your organisation does here. I know it's hard work, but well done. And it's great, as an Israeli certainly, to know that this is going on, that people are holding the flag in quite difficult circumstances. I want to apologise, I suppose I should, I often have to do this, about the certain, let's say, the mystery surrounding this talk. I saw the emails in advance when you were told that the location and the time will be kept secret until the last moment. You may have been wondering why that was necessary, and so perhaps I'll fill you in. If you go home after this and Google the name David Benjamin, but along with the pair of words war criminal, David Benjamin war criminal, you'll get about 600 hits, and in some of them war criminal appears in inverted commas, in others it doesn't, unfortunately. The reason is that several years ago I went on a speaking tour after I left the army to South Africa, which you can probably pick up as where I was born and raised, and let's say I was given a character building welcome over there. We were just discussing now which is worse, as far as being pro-Israel is concerned, if it's worse here or in South Africa. I think South Africa certainly puts up a good fight for that title. Anyway, actually it was a very positive experience in terms of the lectures themselves, because the lectures were really packed from wall to wall, because everybody wanted to try and see what a war criminal looked like. But as I said, it was a character building experience. So since then, I have to take a certain amount of caution when I speak around the world. So thank you for bearing with us on that. Just because my background is in the military, as Jonathan explained, I think I'll concentrate on that kind of thing. Although I should tell you that I do basically deal with Israeli-related issues about international law generally, so in the discussion time, please feel free to widen the topic. I'm going to speak on, I suppose, something quite specific, which is military operations, in the sense of classic military operations that Israel gets up to specifically in Gaza. I think that's probably most of what I'm saying is relevant to that. Also Lebanon, and also the West Bank to some degree. I've just come from a place, by the way, in Germany. I gave a lecture in Germany to an audience of military and security officials from really just about every country in the world except Iran. And I had Saudis and Palestinians and Egyptians and Lebanese, and we used to have Libyans. Not Syrians, they won't be Syrians this time either. So, and I invite them to ask questions too. So really, there's nothing, I don't think there's much you could throw at me that will throw me off course. So I don't think I need to talk too much about what the security challenges are that Israel faces. What I'm going to concentrate on really is, since we built the security fence pretty much completely around the West Bank, of course there's been one around Gaza for a long time. Terrorists have had to be creative. How do they get through the fence? It's very difficult to get through the fence. Of course, what they've discovered is the way to do it is to go over the fence. And they've been extremely resourceful in developing very significant missile firing capability, which is a combination of a homegrown industry Gaza, and also smuggling from overseas, mostly Eastern Bloc, Russian, Chinese-made weapons coming through Egypt, and to the extent that they now have missiles which can reach from Gaza, which can reach Tel Aviv, and even north of Tel Aviv. And in fact, in the last altercation with the folks in Gaza, we had missiles in Tel Aviv. I was actually there for some of that. It's rather an interesting experience seeing what happens when the siren goes off in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, it's not quite London, but there are people there who wear suits and nice clothes. And the instructions that you're given by the home guard are that if the siren goes off and you're not in a building, you can't take shelter in a building. If you're in your car, you're supposed to stop your car and go and lie in the gutter. Okay, so just think how many of you, if you're dressed up like this, want to go and lie in the gutter. So you see people sort of half-heartedly sort of going near the gutter and thinking, well, statistically my chances are quite good even if the missile does fall. And of course, if you know, you watch Israeli TV, you know that there are plenty of Israelis who, even when there are 15 missiles fired at Beersheba simultaneously, they'll be up on their roofs filming the Iron Dome anti-missile system taking the missiles down, which is actually very impressive. The point is, these missiles, and people sometimes point out, well, they've only killed, 15 people in Israel, what's the big deal? The big deal is, you never know where the next one's going to land. Okay, so you actually have millions, literally millions of Israelis, every time the siren goes off, actually you're basically paralyzing the country. And say, God forbid, the next one could just land badly, and it changes the whole look of things. And of course, so we have missiles from Gaza which go up to Tel Aviv and beyond, but also from the north we have Hezbollah, who have a missile capability which is quite clearly much stronger than that possessed by most of the members of the UN. Okay, we're talking something like 50 to 60,000 missiles which can hit just about anywhere in Israel. That's also a concern. And not to be forgotten is the fact that Hamas, I say not to be forgotten because I know it is often forgotten, are really trying very hard to take over the West Bank too, turn that into a launching platform for all sorts of things. Something that isn't, kind of emphasized enough, I think. And in fact, when I spoke to my Palestinian colleagues who were in the audience in my talk in Germany, we spoke about that, and they won't really say it publicly, but I think, on a private level, they'll say they're much more concerned about Hamas and the threat that they pose to them than anything that Israel can cook up. Okay, what are the legal aspects? And the first question that lawyers will have to ask is, okay, what law applies? All of us who studied law, we learn that when people commit crimes, they should be dealt with according to all the intricacies and protections that are contained in the criminal law. Of course, the first thing is you deal with things after the fact, right? No crime, no punishment. In other words, there has to have been something. Somebody has to have done something bad before the criminal law even wakes up. There's certainly no element of preventing things happening in the future. Needless to say, the absurd example is the suicide bomber, right? Once the suicide bomber has done the deed, there's really not much left in order to exercise the criminal law. And of course, there is a school of thought, and I think it's a very compelling one, which says actually terrorism is a crime and should be dealt with as a crime in the same way that, say, organized crime, drug gangs, almost unquestionably dealt with as crimes. In other words, using the criminal law. As I said, I'm from South Africa originally. I haven't been there for many years, but I know that there, many more people are murdered every day in South Africa, than have fallen victim to terror in Israel or in Europe. In a short time, South Africa reaches that kind of, within a few weeks, basically, they get to those kind of numbers. Yet no one in South Africa is arguing that anything but the criminal law should be applied in dealing with that sort of social scourge. So I think there is a compelling argument to say terrorism is a crime and should be treated as such. But of course, what does that mean? It means, first of all, that the crime has been committed. All you can do really with a terrorist, you have to arrest them. And after that, of course, you have to put people on trial. I don't need to tell you guys about all the rules relating to trial and what that means. And of course, even if a person is convicted for terrorism using the criminal law model, okay, that's not the end of the story, because they'll normally have 1 or 2 tiers of appeal above that decision. So that's what it means, dealing with a terrorist under the criminal law model. Now, I hasten to say there are many countries, America still pretty much hangs on to that model. Okay, and they've kind of maybe expanded it a bit. They've taken the offensive conspiracy, for example, and they understand it in a wider sense. It kind of goes towards preventing things that haven't yet happened. But I know, I'm not an expert on UK law, obviously, but we're all aware that the UK has certain, let's call them administrative law tools, in addition to the criminal law, to deal with the problem of terrorism, which obviously covers surveillance, it covers limitations that you can put on freedom of movement, and the extreme one, of course, is being able to incarcerate people for a limited amount of time, but without a trial. Okay? And the idea of doing that is to prevent them, not to have them on the streets and being a danger to the public. And that's pretty common. Most of Europe as well has that kind of model in place. I would call that, it's a criminal law model which is augmented by an administrative law model. I would argue that certainly for, let's just call it the European model of terrorism, which is essentially, a lot of it is homegrown, a lot of it is like small terrorist cells of individuals, relatively numbers terms of people who are really active. There are a relatively small number of people active in it. I think criminal law, augmented by administrative law, can provide the answer. What do you do? I'm going to take you down to our part of the world. Okay. I think it's important to note that there's a spectrum of creatures who we call terrorists. Okay. This is what I want to put an emphasis on here. Is that at the one end, really, you have the sporadic terrorist act, which is dealt with essentially by the law enforcement authorities. What about organizations like Hezbollah or Hamas, okay, with this incredible firepower, okay, the fact that they resemble, in many respects, the militaries of full-blown states, but they happen to be terrorists too. So they're terrorists, but they're terrorist armies. Okay, there's a huge difference between them and the terrorists of Europe. And I think this is a distinction that is again, not emphasized enough. These altercations, if we can call it that, between Israel and these foes like Hezbollah and Hamas are much closer to full-blown wars, in the sense of like confrontations between armies, than they are to just dealing with individuals, as bad as that is. So what does that mean legally speaking? Well, what it means from the Israeli point of view, I think the Israelis were the first country in the world to actually take this leap. And Israel has a problem, of course. We're small, but we're often in a situation where we have to kind of deal with these things before everyone else does. And so we have to stick our necks out and really hope for the best that others are going to follow. But Israel took the leap and said, hang on. This kind of confrontation, which has been going on basically since about the end of the year 2000, okay, where we're facing basically armed militias, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. They have a sort of pretty developed organizational structure. Of course, that's getting better and more advanced all the time. They have considerable firepower. That we say this is something else. This, and here's the crux of the matter, okay, this is what we call an armed conflict. Okay. Now there's a kind of tendency, a traditional tendency in the world to say armed conflict exists between states. It's difficult to kind of get past that. If you look at international law is based on the theory that the world is made up of states, right? What they call the Westphalia system, whereby the world is made up of states, and the theory goes that each state is responsible for what happens within its own territory. And if you take another state to task, it will only be about the way it's behaving towards its neighbors, and it kind of assumes that its state has control of what happens on its territory. Of course, now there's some novelty in what we've been looking at over the last couple of decades is the fact that you have these very significant, very powerful armed groups who are not states, who operate from the territories of other states or from territories which are really undefined, say like the territories which are adjacent to Israel. And international law initially didn't really know how to deal with it. I'm saying, and the idea that wars can only be fought between states is still out there. It isn't entirely behind us. But I think it's fair to say the Israelis stuck their necks out, and much of the world did follow on this. Okay, this idea of saying that a conflict between a state power and these armed groups, okay, who have the firepower of armies of regular states, okay, are armed conflicts, even though they happen to be terrorists. Yes, they're terrorists, okay. And before I just go on, what I mean by terrorist, I mean at a base level definition, terrorist is a person who attacks civilians for political purposes. Okay, that's at a very base level. Yes, that's what they do. That's their modus operandi. Okay, and anticipating the question, what would we do if these people didn't attack civilians, but they sort of played by the rules? Okay, we might be forced to examine this differently. But the way we see them, they are terrorists for sure. Okay, but they are also armies, so they have a kind of dual nature. And because they're armies, and because they're facing people who are using armed force against us, the correct legal regime is the legal regime of armed conflict. And that's very different, very, very different indeed, to the criminal law model. In what way is it different? Okay, in one way in particular. Okay, this is unpleasant to say when you're sitting in London, overlooking the Thames, the most civilized corners of the world, so to speak. Okay, but in armed conflict, it means you can kill people on the other side of the conflict legally. Okay, as opposed to the police who have to deal with terrorists on a local level. And in armed conflict, you can kill. And in fact, if you capture a person on the opposing side who has been killing people on your side, okay, you can't put them on trial. Okay, because it's not a crime to kill in armed conflict. We can kill them and they can kill us. Okay. Having said that, okay, we're talking about terrorists who are involved in armed conflict. There's a fundamental rule of armed conflict which said that to get any kind of special status, any consideration for the fact that you're a combatant, and that's what you do in conflict, is you kill people, okay, you have to play by the rules. In other words, if you're going to get the status of a lawful combatant, and that means the most important upshot of that is that if you're captured, that you are treated as a prisoner of war, and you won't be put on trial for what you did. Okay, if you're a terrorist, on the other hand, and you're captured, may also be a combatant, but you're also a terrorist. Okay, then we would reserve the right, we wouldn't necessarily always exercise it, but we would reserve the right to put that person on trial for crimes. Okay, that's a big difference. Just as an aside, I would say that's the issue with the people that America is holding in Guantanamo Bay. Okay, they're what we call unlawful combatants. They're people who are, fighting a war like a combatant, but they're terrorists. So they don't deserve the rights as a prisoner of war. One has to be very careful there. Again, I'm opening parentheses, but just to get past the point, one has to be very careful there. And I think the Americans were doing this for a while. That doesn't mean there's necessarily a legal vacuum. It doesn't mean that people don't have the status of a prisoner of war, that's free for all. Okay, because that approach did apply for a while when the Americans were in Iraq. Okay, there was a lot of fuss about it. I won't talk about that now. And the Americans have since gone, they've backtracked on that approach. The Israeli approach has always been, don't find a legal vacuum. If there is a legal vacuum, fill it with something close by, which Israel does an awful lot, by the way. Again, opening parentheses, when it does that in relation to what is known as the territories, okay, the occupied administered territories. Okay. We apply a whole bunch of laws to the territories, which are basically the laws of belligerent occupation. Whereas in essence, we don't actually view the territories as being occupied at all. Okay? We view them as having other status. But we apply what we see as being the most relevant law to that situation as a matter of policy, and that kind of, to all intents and purposes, become the law. So you can actually argue about what law really does apply when a state is fighting a non-state actor. It's a possible argument to say that because that non-state actor is not a state, then international law doesn't apply, because international law applies between states. What I'm saying is that as a matter of policy, it's very problematic to go there, because that can have all sorts of ramifications that are actually undesirable. So that's been the approach, is to use what law we have, even though it's clearly inadequate, and to fill the gaps trying to use what we have. Of course, what does that mean? All right, the law of armed conflict is the law of armed conflict. It doesn't mean, okay, free for all, you now have a license to kill. It doesn't mean that at all. There are many, many limitations placed on parties to armed conflicts. We're in the habit, so to speak, of teaching this on one leg. If we have to teach people on one leg, standing on one leg. And the idea is to talk about 4 principles which apply in the case of armed conflicts. The first principle is a principle of military necessity, which is that you don't use military force without there being a necessity to do so. It's kind of a last resort, okay, in international relations. The second one, and here expand the discussion a bit, is the principle of distinction. The principle of distinction says, in essence, you've got civilians and civilian property and everything else related to civilians in one category, and you've got the military, military installations, military equipment, and individuals involved in combat in another category. And you have to distinguish between those two categories at all times. A third very important principle to get one's head around is the principle of proportionality. Even if you're attacking a legitimate target under the principle of distinction, in other words, a military target, okay, you have to look at the potential collateral damage. Collateral damage is the military euphemism for dead or injured civilians or damaged civilian property. You have to look at the potential collateral damage of that military strike. And if that potential damage to civilians would be out of proportion or excessive in relation to the benefit of the military strike, then you may not carry out the strike. Okay, but there are two sides to this. As I say, in one sense it can limit you. In other words, if there are too many civilians around a target, for example, it just means you can't attack the target, you have to go away. Okay, on the other hand, there's a recognition there, okay, that yes, unfortunately, civilians are going to get in the way. It's built into the law of armed conflict. Civilians do get in the way, unfortunately, and there will be civilian casualties, but that's limited by the principle of proportionality. Anticipating another question, well, what is proportionality? How do you know what's proportional? Okay, this is a huge debate. I can tell you as lawyers, we never really want to get into the numbers. We can talk about what factors are relevant when you look at proportionality, but to actually give numbers, sort of, 1 to 3, 1 to... I can tell you, just statistically speaking, what the de facto ratio in Israel has been. Okay, it's the other way around, first of all. Okay, and it's basically something like 3 combatants to 1 civilian. Okay, if you take, and that includes the sort of the high intensity on the ground conflicts like Operation Cast Lead, etc. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a good situation to be in. I'm saying relatively, at least professionally, militarily, operationally speaking, it could be a lot worse. Okay, and I think actually, if you look at the graph of how these things go, the Air Force has actually put this out, I think, officially. You can see, like in their targeted killings, where they're sort of looking, going for individual terrorists using a missile from the air. You can see that the collateral damage has gone right down. There were times when you had between 3 and 6 civilians being killed in the strike, and now it's really just on 0. It's almost like irrelevant. It almost is 0 collateral damage. I don't have it here, but you could look up the way the last confrontation in Gaza, what was called Pillar of Defense. The way it started, it was a targeted strike on the leader of Hamas, the commander of the Hamas military wing. And there, I think you had a very good illustration. It's good that these things are actually coming up, because all this was kept secret before, and there was a kind of built-in product. We know how much care we're taking with it. No one's using it, because back then we didn't want the world to know that we had the capability. We didn't have that. We had these cameras that you could see from such good detail from so far up. Of course, eventually the military was persuaded, because they said there's probably more benefit in releasing this than keeping it secret. Okay, but there you could see exactly how the cameras tracked the car, then hit the car, and 0 collateral damage. In other words, the people killed were the head of the military wing and his security guard, his bodyguard. Okay, that's pretty much, and that really has become representative of how it works now. I'm saying, getting better all the time. If you compare Pillar of Defense to Cast Lead, you can see that you can see this all the time. How it's becoming more precise. And there are all sorts of factors, by the way, that make things less precise. In fact, when you have troops on the ground, it becomes a bit less precise, because you have people who are under direct threat. I'll just make my small two-penny contribution, by the way, to the drone discussion, the discussion about drones. And, there's a lot of concern about drones, about the fact that you can sit in Langley, Virginia, and you can operate a drone which hits somebody somewhere in the desert of Pakistan. People are concerned by the distance, are concerned by this killing is becoming impersonal, and then maybe it's becoming easier than it should be. On the other hand, there's actually an advantage to that, in that the people operating the drone are not under fire. Okay, they're not under the same pressures that the military commanders on the ground are under. Okay, they have a much better picture as well in terms of situation awareness, in terms of what's going on. And they always have the option of backing out if it doesn't, if the opportunity is not good. Okay, they sit in a nice room like this, basically take the decisions, and they can have as many lawyers there as they like. It doesn't work necessarily on the ground, so that is a plus, in fact, of drone warfare. I actually think that's the way things are going. I think drones, those kind of weapons, they will become smaller, they will become more and more accurate, more pinpoint. So they have to be used in conjunction with very good intelligence. But I think that's actually for the future. I think it's, whatever people say, that's where it's going to go. And I think that's actually a good direction. Needless to say, countries involved in these conflicts don't really want to endanger their soldiers very much either. There's become that kind of expectation. Since the first Gulf War, where we had this TV war, you had this complete routing of the Iraqi army in almost no time at all by the Americans. That's kind of become the expectation, if you think about it, for civilians living in Western countries. For Israelis too. We kind of expect that to happen, because we have all this, we're advanced with national defense. Because that's why the second Lebanon war was very disappointing, because it didn't turn out quite that well. So that's how that works. Now, I think it's a good example, really, to point out the difference between applying the criminal law model and the international law of armed conflict model is if you take targeted killings, the subject of targeted killings, because if you're in the criminal law model, what is a targeted killing? Right? It's an extrajudicial execution, quite obviously illegal. But if you're in the armed conflict model, targeted killing is, it's tried as just part of you killing a combatant on the other side. That's what you do in armed conflicts. It's actually not an issue. Targeted killings doesn't actually deserve a special name. It's something you do in armed conflicts. So, as I'm saying, it's very important to understand that distinction. Once you've made that distinction, you accept that Israel is in an armed conflict with Hamas, an armed conflict with Hezbollah, that really all sorts of things fall into place if you do that. Again, I'll mention in parentheses, if you talk about the flotilla issue, okay, the legality of intercepting the flotilla, all right, that all depends on whether you accept that there's an armed conflict between Israel and Hamas. If there's an armed conflict, then the laws of warfare at sea apply, and with the laws of warfare at sea, you can blockade hostile territory. You can intercept ships who are trying to break into the blockade. That's actually no big deal. It happens all the time. If you don't accept the armed conflict, it may sound obvious that it's an armed conflict, but believe it or not, it's not obvious to many. Okay, one of the people who I happen to know it wasn't obvious to, at least back then, was Justice Goldstone. Okay, because this doesn't so much come up in his report, but I had a friend who went to one of his lectures, and he was asked, it's all very well what you're saying about all these terrible things the Israelis have done in Gaza, but what did you actually expect them to do to deal with this kind of threat? Missiles coming out of Gaza. And he said, well, police raids. Okay, police raids, it means, the police go and knock on people's doors and, excuse me, come along with me, sort of thing. That's, anyone who's got any clue about how Gaza works would know that. You don't have to have been through the military like me to know that actually entering Gaza just a few hundred yards, in fact, is a major military operation. Okay. So there's kind of this insistence on applying these legal principles, which, because the terrorists are dealt with by criminal law, in a situation where it's completely inappropriate. The last principle, by the way, I said there were 4 principles, so let me just give you the last one, which is called the principle of humanity. Which means even when you're targeting somebody who may be legitimately killed, you mustn't cause unnecessary suffering. There's a whole body of law then which limits the kind of things like the kind of munitions, the kind of weapons you could use. Kind of certain practices are illegal under that because they cause unnecessary suffering. So we've said, hopefully you have an idea. Okay, those are the limitations, those are the principles we have to apply. Just again, proportionality, to put it in different terms so we have a good understanding before we move on. Basically, you weigh up the value of the military target. Okay, you weigh up the proportion of the collateral damage. If the collateral damage is too high, you can't attack the military target. That's the principle. Okay. Now, this is a good opportunity to show you the movie.
Human shielding involves the intentional placement of innocent civilians in harm's way in order to protect the lives of combatants or hide illicit military actions. The forceful sacrifice of an innocent sanctity of life is considered a war crime, but first and foremost, it is a reprehensible violation of the universal concept of human decency. Hamas has fully integrated human shielding as a basic element of its terrorist doctrine, initiating live fire attacks against Israel Defense Forces from within civilian crowds, hiding weapons manufacturing facilities and storage depots in residential buildings and places of worship.
تحت الجوال وإذا به يسأل أنت أبو بلال الشعبي؟ قلت نعم. فقال أنا الأمن الإسرائيلي معك 5 دقائق دخلي أنت أولادك. فقفلت الجوال على الفور واتصلت ببعض الأصدقاء فهرع الأهالي عبر مكبرات الصوت وبلأوا سطح المنزل وظلوا حتى الآن يعني مرابطون على سطح المنزل إلى أن يشاء الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Civilians, including women and children, are also exploited by being placed at military targets which Hamas expects to be attacked.
المواطنون وفور سماع نبأ التهديد باستهداف المنزل خرجوا من منازلهم متوجهين إلى منزل الجعابير ليشكلوا دروعا بشرية في محاولة لمنع قصف المنزل.
ولذلك أصبح الموت عند الشعب الفلسطيني صناعة تجيده النساء، تجيده كل من في هذه الأرض. ذلك شكلوا دروعا بشرية من النساء والأطفال والشيوخ والمجاهدين، وكأنهم يقولون للعدو الصهيوني إننا نحرص على الموت كما تحرصون على الحياة.
It's all very well as a lawyer to come and say you have to abide by the 4 principles, but it doesn't get you very far because then you have this kind of situation. Intelligence, intelligence, intelligence. Because if you want to know how you know actually what you can shoot at and what you can't, where the targets are and where the missile depots are and where the infrastructure is, it's only through intelligence because there's nothing that looks guilty on the face of it. Okay? So you need really good intelligence. Unfortunately, Israel has good intelligence with Gaza because Israel knows Gaza very well. I will say that you can imagine in other places in the world similar situations could come about where you won't have such great intelligence. Okay? It takes a while to get intelligence. It's not something you just have just like that. I'll go back to the Goldstone example. Okay? Let's say Mr. Goldstone is getting his guided tour of Gaza through Hamas guided tour of Gaza. Okay? And they take him to a civilian apartment building which has been reduced to rubble by an Israeli bomb. So far, by the way, factually, we're in agreement. Okay? Hamas are saying, look, this is a civilian building. Okay? Remember the principle of distinction, you're not allowed to attack civilians. Ergo, war crime. Okay? Believe me, by the time Goldstone arrives, there's no trace of anything military left in that building. The Israelis, so then Goldstone would say, okay, well, it's Israel, the burden of proof has shifted here. There's something which needs to be explained. And Israel will say, well, that was being used by Hamas. That was a military target. There was a weapons depot. And Goldstone, well, I didn't see any sign of that. Could you prove it, please? Okay. Now, we probably have, back in the military headquarters in Tel Aviv, a file like that of information from various sources of intelligence information pointing to the fact, monitoring, surveillance, you name it, that building is what we say it is. Okay. But I promise you that not for the next 50 years, but to 100 years at least, okay, will that information ever be released. Okay. It's very, very deeply classified. There are, probably not far from here, there's information being stored from the Second World War, okay, which is still classified. Because it's that sensitive. Okay? The Second World War finished quite a while ago. We're still in the midst of an armed conflict. Okay? There's no way that intelligence information is going to be released. Okay? At this stage. Okay? The problem, by the way, it's not only releasing the intelligence information. Sometimes you can't even tell the enemy. Not sometimes. Usually, you can't even tell the enemy what you know about them, because that information in itself can be reverse engineered. Okay? So you have a huge built-in problem. that all your evidence, because there's nothing here which is on the face of the military. Remember, in a normal war, okay, you have people in uniforms who are basically fighting each other. You capture a person on the other side. You don't have to. There's no proof problem about whether that person is a POW. He or she is wearing a uniform. That's it. End of story. By the way, you see them on parade. They wear uniforms. When the fighting starts, the uniforms come off. That's the way they work. Now, there's no. You don't have the proof. You have to sort of. Each one has to be individually proved. And normally, what you've got to work on is this intelligence. And that intelligence can be reviewed by, say, Israeli courts, for example. Okay, but there's no way in hell, that an Israeli officer, who heaven forbid, is dragged before the International Criminal Court, which I hope doesn't ever happen, okay, for some sort of military operation in Gaza, okay, and which is necessarily based on intelligence information. Okay, there's no way that person will have a way of defending themselves. Okay, because he won't be. I assume that he won't have the authorization, okay, to be able to use the intelligence information to explain. Well, actually, that's not a war crime. That's a legitimate target. It's a big built-in problem. I can tell you what I think the solution to that problem is. It's not a perfect solution, but I think it's the only solution. That you have to have domestic institutions which have enough, which are trusted by the international community sufficiently, okay, who can review those sort of decisions. The Israeli Supreme Court, for example, which, by the way, you probably have heard, has no problem. Everything is justiciable in Israel, including military operations. So they will review it. Of course, they have clearance. They have the clearance. Well, certainly, if the government, let's put it this way: if the government, wants to, it can bring the information to court. If the government can choose it, if something so sensitive, it doesn't even want to bring it to the Supreme Court, but then the government has lost the case. Okay. On the issue of targeted killings, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled, actually made two very interesting. It was a very interesting judgment. It's the first time a domestic court anywhere in the world has actually made a decision on the laws of war. Okay, because generally the rule is, I would say outside of Israel, the rule is courts don't deal with those kind of things. Right? Justiciability 101. They just don't deal with those kind of things. Targeted killing, even though the laws of war applies, doesn't mean you can automatically kill a terrorist. You have to first try and arrest them. Only if the arrest isn't viable can you use the other option. You can see that, by the way, on the ground. You compare the way the IDF operates in the West Bank, the way it operates in Gaza. In West Bank, because most of the West Bank is more accessible, most of the operations are aimed at arresting people.
We are extremely grateful that David's been able to come and talk to us, and thank you in the